Today we're going to practice turning remainders into decimals, but we're going to start the problems the same way. So my estimate for 75 divided by 4, I'll probably think of this as 80 divided by 4, which I know is 20. So guessing somewhere in the 20 range. Now I'm ready to solve. So I have 75 inside the house. It's the dividend. It's what I'm dividing, and 4 is the divisor, so it goes outside of the house. I first asked myself how many times 4 goes into 7, or how many groups of 4 can fit into 7, and that's just 1. 1 times 4 is 4. So then I'm going to subtract 7 minus 4, which is 3, and then bring down this 5. 4 goes into 35. Let's see, 4 times 9 is 36. That's too big, so 4 times 8, which is 32. I subtract and leaves me with 3. Now instead of stopping here and just saying 18 remainder 3, what I can do is add a decimal point that I'm going to float straight up into my answer. It's going to line up with the decimal and the quotient, and or the decimal and the quotient is going to line up with the decimal and the dividend. And I can add a placeholder 0. There's an infinite number of placeholder zeros after that decimal point that don't change the value of 75, and then I can bring it down just like I would any other digit. And now ask myself, how many times does 4 go into 30, which is 7. 4 times 7 is 28. Subtract, and I'm left with 2. Now I can add another placeholder 0 in the hundredths place. Bring it down. And now I'm asking myself, how many times does 4 go into 20? And that is 5 times exactly. I subtract, I'm left with 0, which means I'm done. I don't have a remainder. My final exact answer is 18 and 75 hundredths. If I wanted to, I could do the inverse operation and multiply this times 4 and see if I get up to 75. See, 4 times 5 is 20, so carry plus 2. 4 times 7 is 28, plus 2 is 30. I'm going to carry plus 3. 4 times 8 is 32, plus 3 is 35. So I'm going to carry plus 3. Then 4 times 1 is 4, plus 3 is 7. And then I have to add back the decimal, and I got back to 75 even, which is where I started. So our quotient is 18 and 75 hundredths. Let's try another one. 142 divided by 5. If I were estimating, I would probably think about this as 150 divided by 5. I know that 15 divided by 5 is 3, add the extra 0, so I'm guessing somewhere in the 30 range. Alright, to actually solve, first I start with asking myself how many groups of 5 fit into 1, and that is 0, because 5 is bigger than 1. So now I have to go next door and look at this as 14. 5 goes into 14 2 times, which is 10. 14 minus 10 is 4. Bring down the 2. 5 goes into 42. Let's see, 5 times 8 is 40. 5 times 9 is 45, which would be too big. So 8 times, 5 times 8 is 40. Subtract, I'm left with 2. Now, we're not going to stop here. Instead of just leaving a remainder, we're going to add a decimal point and a placeholder 0 in the tenths place, which doesn't change the value of 142. It just allows us to continue to divide. And I'm going to flip the decimal straight up into the quotient, into the answer, lining it up with the decimal and the dividend. And now I can drop this 0 and continue to solve. 5 goes into 20 4 times even. 4 times 5 is 20. I subtract, and I'm left with 0. So my final answer, the quotient, is 28 and 4 tenths. Okay, thinking about an estimate for this one, I'd probably turn 310 into 300, because I know that 30 divided by 6 is 5, add that extra 0, and I'm guessing somewhere in the 50 range. Now to actually solve, 6 goes into 3 0 times. Notice I'm lining that 0 right above the 3. Now I'm looking at the 31. 6 times 5 is 30, so I know that I can have 5 groups of 6 that fit into 31. Now I can subtract. 31 minus 30 is 1. Bring down the 0. Now I have 10. 6 goes into 10 one time. I'm going to subtract. 10 minus 6 is 4. Now I'm not done. I can add the decimal, float it straight up into my answer, add a placeholder 0, and bring it down. 6 goes into 40. Let's see, 6 times 6 is 36. I'm left with 4. I can add another placeholder 0, bring it down, and you'll notice now 6 goes into 40 6 times. I subtract, I'm left with 4 again. So you can see that this pattern is going to continue. So instead of just continuing to add a placeholder 0 and make this 51.66666 and so on, all I have to do is put a little line above the 6, and that tells us that 6 is repeating forever. So there's not a remainder, or we're not writing it with a remainder, or we turn that remainder into a decimal, but the decimal doesn't terminate. That means it doesn't end or get to an exact amount. So this line above the 6 tells us that that 6 is going to just continue on. Okay, come up with an estimate and then solve. I'd probably think of this as 200 divided by 5, which is 40. And now I'm ready to solve. 5 goes into 2 0 times, so now I'm going to look at the 22. I know that 5 times 4 is 20, so 22 minus 20 is 2. I can bring down this 6. I know that 5 times 5 is 25. I'm going to subtract and I'm left with 1. Now I'm going to add a decimal that I'm going to float straight up, and a placeholder 0 that I can bring down. And now I'm asking myself, how many times does 5 go into 10? And that is 2 times exactly, and I'm done. So my final answer, the quotient, is 45 and 2/10. And if I did quick inverse operation, multiplying 45 and 2/10 times 5, looks like 2,260, but I have to add the decimal back, which gets me back to 226, so that checks out. Come up with an estimate and then solve. Okay, for my estimate, I probably think about this as 480 divided by 6. I know that 48 divided by 6 is 8, so add the 0, and that gives me an estimate of about 80. Now I'm ready to solve. 6 goes into 4 0 times. Now I got to look at the 47. Now that 6 times 8 is 48, so that's too big, so I have to go with 6 times 7, which is 42. I'm going to subtract it, I'm left with 5, and then I can bring down this 1. All right, 6 goes into 51 8 times. 6 times 8 is 48. I'm left with 3. Now instead of ending here and leaving a remainder, I'm going to add a decimal, float it right up into my answer in a placeholder 0 that I can bring down. And now I'm asking myself how many times 6 goes into 30, and that is 5 times exactly. So I'm left with a remainder of 0. I don't need to bring anything else down, so my quotient, my final answer, is 78 and 5/10.